Leading our conversation today are Ludi Goodson, co-author of Online Teaching at Its Best, Catherine Harris, Senior Director of the Center for Effective Teaching and Learning at Cal State LA, and Flower Darby, Director of Teaching for Student Success at Northern Arizona University. And I'm Kevin Kelly. I'm honored to be moderating this conversation dedicated to the topic at engaging students in readings and microlectures. Before joining ACUE, I led online teaching and learning and faculty development teams at San Francisco State University, where I still teach online courses every semester. Like all of you, I'm looking forward to learning with and from our experts, so let's get started. Welcome, panelists. Ludi, thank you for agreeing to start the conversation.
Yes, I just want to say hello to everyone. I'm really happy to be here and with the whole ACUE team, and I hope everyone is doing well and staying safe. And I wanted to start with recognizing what I think all of us make as an assumption, and that is the goal for readings and micro lectures in an online course is the same as what we would have in a classroom. And to consider that small change can produce big learning. And I want to tell you a story about a really wonderful instructor in an engineering course. And he was a dedicated professional, and he carefully crafted a PowerPoint presentation with clear visuals and graphs, and he used audio with each slide, and the whole presentation was about 18 minutes. And he provided it up front along with the syllabus for his course. But after about 2 weeks into the course, he came to me complaining that his students were asking him a lot of questions in emails and in his online office about much of what he'd already covered in his presentation. And I simply asked him, well, what do you think they did? And after a long pause, he said, oh, they turned me off. And this doesn't just happen with presentations, you know, whether it's a PowerPoint or a video lecture or a podcast or a screencast, it also happens with readings. And my co-author and friend, Linda Nilsson, recently talked about her experiences in teaching when she was doing it in the mid-70s, and all the students read all of the assigned readings for the activities in class. But then when she was teaching in the 80s and 90s, she noticed they weren't doing that. And that's when she began reaching out and trying to find other ways to engage the students. And she started using a lot of reading wrappers, which contain reflection questions about maybe what was the most valuable or surprising or important point of a reading. And we can use the same approach with recorded lectures. The engineering instructor who was teaching his first online course immediately did some rethinking about creating shorter presentations and giving students more advanced information about why they should bother viewing them. And Linda did something similar when she was working with her students to try to get them to answer the questions in the reading wrappers, simply telling them why. And then the students were a lot more comfortable. In thinking of micro lectures and readings, we can think of short bursts of study time. So while one size does not fit all, we usually think of a micro lecture as about 1 to 6 minutes. And I smile every time I see Michael Wesch with his face up close to the camera, and he asks, how long do you think you can watch me talk? I mean, even if you have a long lecture, you can still have time markers for students and focus your questions and other engagement activities on those segments, or you can find some high quality videos on YouTube and add your own questions to them. For all these options, you can apply the same teaching strategies you already use for student engagement. For example, students can answer questions before, during, and after lectures or readings and submit them for a few points. You can give them some worksheets or some skeletal outlines to fill out and ask them to create maybe a visual representation of what they're studying. You know, they can draw something, whether it's a concept map or a flowchart or something else, take a snapshot with a camera and then upload it to the course site. You could also create follow-up questions for a discussion or maybe for an informal chat. You can prompt reflections often by just asking 2 questions. You know, what was the most important? and what was the most difficult, and get some good responses from that. Or ask students to come up with their own questions. That also works really well. Let's go on to the next slide, because I want to think about the fact that students do choose the micro version of things. When I was looking at some of the research, I noticed that students, when given a choice between the long lectures and the micro lectures, they chose the micro ones. And not only that, of course, the rate of reviewing the micro lectures went far up when they were about to have a major exam. And I suspect this is because of the ease of navigating and finding information in the micro lectures, but also because even if it's a short reading, it becomes easier to apply the information when they have the opportunity to do it right away. You know, it might just be the spark that they need for feeling good about what it is that they are studying. As an instructional designer, I've also worked with a math instructor who used very active learning strategies in his classrooms, but he had never taught online. And yet, with his first online course, he was able to use micro lectures with embedded quiz questions, and it became an award-winning course. And I saw the ratings from his students, and they were filled with excitement about his teaching techniques. And this is why I'm also so excited about micro lectures and short readings, because giving students tiny bursts of study time on a few key terms or a critical concept or an important skill, I think this is a great way to engage them in a deeper level of excitement about their learning.
Thank you, Ludi. And Flower, I know you've recently written a book called Small Teaching Online, so micro lectures might be something you have something to say about.
Well, certainly, we know that everybody's attention spans are decreasing these days, including our own, and so why not extend race to our students and give them small pieces of content that they can meaningfully engage with. Love what Ludi was just saying about you know, students can reflect more meaningfully if it's just on a few key terms or critical concepts. I think there's a lot of potential with that approach for sure.
Fantastic. And Catherine, I know you're going to be talking about readings, but does this discussion of micro lectures evoke anything for you?
I totally agree. Folks are very distracted right now. So the micro lecture is probably an improvement and will really facilitate remote learning.
Great. Well, Kat, these ideas echo your topic nicely, so why don't you go next?
So it's really interesting, the time we're in right now. It's actually a very good time to read during a pandemic. Reading is a de-stressor. Reading improves attention spans. So in this really difficult time, it should be a consolation to know that even unsupervised reading is actually very effective, sometimes better than lecturing. Donald Bly's got a pretty seminal book called What's the Use of Lectures? There's an updated, I think it's 2013 version, highly recommended, 40 case studies. There's not a lot of difference between lecture and discussions, independent reading, or unsupervised reading. So what I want to talk a little bit about is how we think about, in a way, sort of supervising that reading, which Ludi was kind of getting at, so that it's even more effective. I really recommend this book for those of you who feel so duty-bound to lecture during this time. Reading and micro lecture sequencing, if you can actually get to the sweet spot, actually can replace some of that lecturing. So it's so-called low bandwidth teaching. In the next slide, I though always need to pose this question: what is reading? Because people think of reading, it's different things to different people. Primarily, reading is a form of problem solving. And actually, you can have a relationship with the text. Different disciplines have different genres of reading and writing that they engage in. And they can sort of invite people in. And sometimes the language, if you've ever read a law brief, can keep people out. Reading is very complex. It's a personal act, and it's a social act. And I'm taking the next slide from the Reading Apprenticeship body of work. And if you've not heard of Reading Apprenticeship, This is a marvelous way to think about chunking out your reading. So what I've got on this slide is a possible sequence that you could take to order and structure short readings during this time. You could start with something as simple as guided questions. Ludi talked about that, but you want to establish a routine. You want to get students into a sequence or a normative rhythm that is online that they can sort of move and track with you. So you want students to, you always want to have social presence online, and reading is one way to do this. I think about second graders in reading circles and how precious that is, and how actually important that is. And we sort of are the most prepared reading-wise in the world in the 4th grade, and then we sort of fall off by the 11th. And I actually think that there's nothing wrong with thinking about reading, which is a precondition for writing during college. So employ those online patterns in your learning management system. You can have a rubric for any discussion posting. If it's a live discussion about reading, you want to facilitate it. But basically what we know is that if you're assigning reading and you're not discussing the reading, that's not okay. You actually want to discuss any reading that you assign. And so, so what could this pattern of reading look like for students to themselves? You actually want to think about something called golden lines. That's one approach. That's where you actually ask students to interact with the reading in a personal way, to underline something that they think is changed their thinking, impacted their learning, supported understanding. Maybe it annoyed them, maybe it excited them, maybe it raised a question. And then you have a group discussion come out of that where folks share the reasons. You really have to start there with an act as complicated as reading, especially if you have a genre. So imagine you're in a social science course and you have, you're reading a classic case study. It follows the introduction, methods, results, discussion, format. Students don't always know this. So it's really good to think about your discipline, the way your discipline thinks about reading, the way your discipline uses a written communication, and then start the writing there. Finally, I've got on that right-hand side a sort of an order. You can mix this up whichever way you like, but it's a sort of it's a routine that I use in my own classes where I get students to come together, do a reading, ask questions. It's okay if you don't understand in my class, just to say, you know, if you read something and you really don't even know what this is about, bring us your question. What don't you understand? That's legitimate too. You can give a quiz before reading. My students do the readings. I think it's all about structure, and Ludi was talking about that earlier. Structure and stepwise instruction. They'll get into the habit and they'll be very thankful. Reading is critical thinking.
Wonderful. Thanks, Catherine. And Ludi, Catherine just mentioned the connections between the two things that you both just described. What response do you have related to Catherine's ideas?
Oh, I think they're all excellent ideas, including having the students set their reading goals, which was also on this set of suggestions she had. That's also a good idea, actually, for the whole course when you have a chance to do that. Also, I remember a student at Georgia Southern who was, he had, you know, a lot of readings, and he would complain to me every week. You know, he says, you know, I don't know why the instructor is having me do these summaries. It's just, I just take the information from the reading and I just do a summary and I don't know why. So I think that is another part of, you know, the motivation for doing a reading, besides the really good questions that Kat mentioned, which is to ask, you know, how has it changed your thinking? Was there anything that excited you about it? Because, you know, when we can attach emotions to whatever it is we're studying, we're more likely to remember it better and remember it for a longer time. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was the importance of what she said in the last part, which is that part of thinking aloud, well, thinking through your discipline for whatever that reading genre is. That's a really great opportunity actually to do a micro lecture, which could be a talk aloud about how I think through when I'm reading in this kind of genre.
Nice. Flower, do you have any thoughts about what Kat and Ludi just shared?
Well, what I really love about Kat's mini presentation was this idea of the golden lines, when we can invite students to engage with our course content and relate it to their own personal lived experience, we know that it does hook them in a much more intrinsically engaging and interesting way. So I really like that suggestion for sure.
And from my part, I just wanted to mention something that popped up in the chat for everyone. A participant mentioned hypothesis, and I wanted to mention with this slide that Kat has put together about making reading social, that we can do that in a pedagogical way with prompts and even activities like Jigsaw or things that you can still do remotely, but also technologically with Digo, Hypothesis, Classroom Salon. These are all what are known as collaborative reading tools where you can have people annotate collectively. You could even prime the pump by having instructor questions attached to specific paragraphs. What did this make you think before you move on? How is this transition? All these types of questions that you can ask or answer, and even have the students engage in that process. So I think this has been a great conversation and really sets us up for Flower to take us home.
Well, thank you, Kevin. So I knew that Ludi and Kat had planned to provide some good overview material. What I wanted to do is to really provide some concrete practical examples of how you can do this. So both Ludi and Kat referred to sort of guiding questions or worksheets. What I have here on the screen is a great example from two faculty at NAU, Ana Araya Ancheta and Mar Hill, both of whom are ACUE credentialed and who have had a tremendous amount of success in their first year gateway course, Bio 181. And so what this is a simple table that students complete and turn in for points. And for me, that really is key. Points are the economy which students pay attention to. So if you know that you want your students to dig into your content, whether it be reading or a lecture or video, you definitely need to give them some accountability and some structure to help them do that. We also know from the neuroscience that as an expert in your field, you're able to organize new information in meaningful ways, but novice learners, such as your students, don't have the structure. So what I love about this worksheet is it's very clear, really not too hard to fill out, but keeps students paying attention. And you know, I taught online for years. I've taught online for over 12 years now. And it took me forever to realize that it was fine to take some activities outside of the learning management system. So I would recommend posting, say, a PDF of a worksheet such as this. Ask your students to print it out. They can fill it out by hand and then take a picture with their smartphone and upload the picture as, you know, for points, for proof that they completed the work. You could also consider providing a link to a collaborative workspace such as a Google Doc or a Microsoft Word Online document if you're not sure that students are going to have the ability to print. But even still, they could replicate this worksheet on a notebook paper and then take a picture of that notebook paper. So for me, I love the simplicity and sort of the physicality really of this idea. The next slide that I have to show is where these two instructors have gone from that simple worksheet. Ludi mentioned concept maps as a way for students to organize their learning and represent it and depict it. And I just love this example from the same two faculty at NAU who provide this with every topic in their Bio 181 course. Students have to complete this concept map as they're working through that content. They turn that in for points too. Keep in mind, these are only 5 points each. It doesn't have to be a lot of points, but some points help students do this work. And then, this is really the key, is that after students have submitted their completed concept maps, then they can access the answer key, basically, the instructor provided completed concept map. And I think that just allows the opportunity for students to do the work. Again, this is on paper with pencil or pen. They take a picture and upload it. But then there's also the assurance that students are getting accurate and correct information. They may not have figured everything out in this relatively complex concept map regarding cells and functions, but when the instructor provides the answer key, so to speak, that adds a layer of accuracy. So that's really all I had to talk about here, is just the value of structuring activities for students to help them organize new information, to help them be paying attention. Again, the worksheet, the concept map, and other ideas, it works equally well for both video micro lectures for readings, and I would add for your in-person teaching as well. I know many of us struggle to get our students to do the reading, as Ludi was discussing earlier, and so why not assign something like this in your face-to-face class also? I'll leave it there for now. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions and ongoing conversation as we go.
Many thanks, Flower. Kat, would you like to reflect on what Flower told us?
Yeah, I mean, I complete agreement about the need for structure. Novices are different from experts because they think it's all about content, but experts know it's really about disciplinary structures and beliefs and frameworks. So the framework matters deeply. And it's sometimes, I think, more and more important with the world awash in content that we think a little bit more about how we think about problem solving, how we think about our disciplinary structures, and perhaps a little less about the content, showing students how to think like a biologist, or how to think like a human geographer, how to think like an historian.
Mm-hmm.
Really good point. Ludi, would you like to wrap up this topic before we move to the Q&A part?
I agree with so much that was said, you know, because the experts do think in parallel multiple levels, and sometimes we forget that's what's going on. And the structure that Flower showed us, that example, you know, it asks students to really think about what it is that they are looking at. So that increases the amount of reflection that they're doing, which of course is going to increase their learning. And then I think also, again, that what Kat just said about the importance of remembering how we think in individual disciplines. What is our process of thinking? And again, going through that with the students will help them know how they're supposed to be thinking about whatever it is that they are studying.
And if I could add to that, I think sometimes we forget what it's like to be experts. Our knowledge base is so compressed. We've internalized all of this, structure, content, all of it. We have a million ways that we standardize the way that we evaluate things, the criteria we have, our benchmarks for excellence. This is all opaque to students. We really need to step back and think like they do, and that means really backing it up. So I love that concept map for biology, because it really starts there, and we should never think that any novice wouldn't benefit from starting where the students are.
Well, and I think that really is thank you, Kat. That's a really good way to lead into the Q&A session, because we often forget that students don't often have an opportunity to learn how to learn. And so one of the questions that emerged in the Q&A that I'm going to modify slightly to apply to both readings and microlectures: what are some examples of goals students could set before starting a reading or a microlecture? And I will add my own little twist. How do we scaffold that process so they start doing it on their own without our prompts after a certain amount of time? So who'd like to field that one?
I would like to start, and I won't have much to say, but I will tell you, when I was studying a book written by Isabel, when I was first trying to become an instructional designer, that was one of the hardest books I had ever tried to understand. So no one said, do this, but I thought, if I'm ever going to get anywhere, I'm going to have to think through and add just one keyword for each page that symbolizes to me just what Isabel is actually talking about. And he was talking about the cognitive structures that we normally develop over time as we have more knowledge, more expertise. Now I'll just hand it off to someone else.
Kat, do you have anything to add there? I'd love to hear what you're thinking.
I mean, it's such an interesting time, because I think the movement to remote learning means that we must now be incredibly mindful about everything that we do. So this requires another level of redundancy and structure that was really just implicit in our face-to-face course. So face-to-face, there's all these amazing, like, visual students. I mean, just the way that just humans are so gregarious, and the way that we're made, the way that we think about being with other people, you're missing all of that online. So this requires doubling down and an even greater level of redundancy, if you will. And I don't think students mind that. It's like wearing a jacket, and when I'm face-to-face, I don't have to think about putting it on, but when I'm online, I actually have to take it off and look at the seams and see about the way it's constructed and maybe repeat things. And that's okay, but we just need to know that that's the benchmark for instructional design and for thinking like a designer, as Ludi was saying.
Yeah, I just want to add, again, a practical reflection that came to my mind. I have 3 daughters. They're in middle school and high school, and they're doing remote learning right now too. And it's very interesting as a parent to watch the efforts of their hardworking teachers. But, my daughters, prior to this current situation, I've heard them at the dinner table saying, you know what, I'm really thankful that Miss Irby made us write those 5-word summaries for each paragraph that we read, because it really helped us in our later honors classes to have that practical strategy. And so maybe, Kevin, to get back to your question about how do we scaffold, maybe it's something very simple like that. Maybe we ask students to do a summary. Maybe it's 5-word. I know my daughters found that challenging to boil it down. And then, maybe it's for a paragraph. Maybe it's a summary of a section in the textbook. But I think if we can embed messaging with the task that says, I'm asking you to do this for points right now, but keep in mind, this is a strategy that can work in all of your classes here, this semester and moving forward. And just maybe it's the case that as the semester wears on, that activity is not required for points anymore. You just encourage your students to do it. Or maybe you do assign it every week and students have the opportunity to submit those summaries for points throughout the duration of your course. When we can wrap that around with some messaging about the value of this and how it is really helping them process and better understand these new concepts, maybe students will take a page from Ludi's book and sort of say, you know what, I'm not required to do this in this class, but I know this would be helpful for me. And so helping students to make those connections about strategies we require them to do, and then helping them to take them out into other learning contexts, classes, and beyond.
Fantastic. And to your point about the whole scaffolding process, one thing that I use in my own online course, and I do it as an option so that it's not required, but most students choose to do it. I have them take a survey, and it's a lot of big words. It's the Metacognitive Awareness of Reading Strategies Inventory, or MARCI. And really what it does, the act of taking the survey gets them to think about, what am I not doing when I read? Am I thinking about what I'm hoping to get out of this reading, or micro lecture for that matter, before I begin? Am I writing down key questions that I want to answer by doing it, and so on. So there are tools that we can use to scaffold that process. And as Flower mentioned, something that we do for them early on, but that they can take with them, like your children's strategy of 5-word summaries of each paragraph. And before we jump in, because there are questions about both the pedagogical side of this whole topic and the technological side, but I found one of the comments in the Q&A pretty interesting. The participant said, I find reading relaxing, but my impression from many of my students is that they don't find it relaxing. Many find it an unpleasant challenge. So do you have any ideas about how to overcome that, especially for topics like this instructor who teaches chemistry?
Can I go ahead?
I mean, absolutely. But it's like everything else. It's a deeply metacognitive act, and you have to know where you are in the reading. So I think the secret sauce is to help the student locate themselves and the connections that they're making to the text by inviting interpretation. So the student has to be allowed to service misconceptions. So that doesn't mean there's always a right answer. I mean, we focus on reading like that, like there's some right answer. Here's the chief point that the author was trying to make. I think we're also equally well served by asking students what their thoughts are about the reading, where they're struggling, how they're interpreting what they're reading. There are, especially in reading apprenticeship, there's a very interesting exercise where you can actually observe something and say the writer is saying this, but then you can make an inference. I think the writer means that. And that is, again, one of those expert things that we just gloss over when we think about students engaging with text. We have to allow students just to tell us what they're seeing and where there's some confusion or where they don't understand, or maybe where they're feeling uncomfortable. Maybe it's, I don't understand what these chemical terms are. I'm going to circle every phrase I don't understand. And then you walk back through that with them. I think we actually have to teach students how to read. Students have grown up reading textbooks. Now they're in a very prescriptive environment with bells ringing, and now they're online, and there's very little that's prescriptive there. So reading would just be a cat in a bag unless we're really thinking sort of structurally about how we're going to allow them to have some agency and identify with different ideas and honor those connections to the text that they may have. And I would argue you can do it for any discipline, even the bench sciences, but you have to start with where the students are.
That actually leads directly to what I wanted to say. And for me, it's, I appreciate your practical suggestions, Kat. For me, it's important for us to take a step back and remember that our students may not be like us. So this question was, I find reading, relaxing? And, why don't my students also do that? I really love the way Jose Bowen, the author of Teaching Naked, describes how, we're kind of the weird ones, that we love learning so much that we pursued it all the way to doctorate level and made it our entire career. And he's got a great analogy about, for example, we're like the personal trainers at the gym who love working out so much that we make it our work. And the people who hire personal trainers need a little more support and accountability and guidance. And so just reminding ourselves that our students may not be like us. And so to be intentional about the structure that you're providing to them, to help them learn how to read and learn how to learn. I think that's a really important reflection to take a little bit of time to think about.
I'd like to add that finding meaning in whatever it is that they are reading is so very important. And that's why the questions that Kat mentioned earlier, how has this changed your thinking, can help to do that. And the other basic questions of, what did you find that was most important, or what did you find that was most difficult? And I did want to go ahead and piggyback on what you said, Flower, because the whole idea of the differences in us and the ways that we approach reading, also studying, are very different from novices. And I don't know if you're familiar with Stephen Chew's series about the misconceptions that students make about how they study. Mm-hmm. That would be a really great resource for students, so that they're not just reading and rereading, but they're also looking for the meaning in whatever it is they're reading or viewing, on a video.
Right.
Well, if we make a slight shift from enjoyment or relaxation related to reading and motivation period, one of the participants asked, how do you remotely motivate people to read or check out the microlectures if you cannot grade their work, if there aren't points involved in their pursuit of these instructional materials?
So you can grade the work. You can have, so let's pretend we're online and our LMS is Canvas. You're using a learning management system. You can create a rubric for discussion postings, and you can actually automate a good deal of that. You can tell students that you will grade, say, 2 of maybe 6 or 8 discussion postings. So to do a good job on all of them, because you'll simply pick the ones that you found interesting. I actually think you can track with students this way. They can submit golden lines, they can submit reading reflections. I think reflection, again, it's metacognitive, reading is metacognitive. They sort of go hand in hand. So I think there is a way that you can I wouldn't grade it in the beginning because reading is so personal. You wanted them to hit their stride. But I think as they move out from their own perceptions of the readings to larger course discussions, those can be graded.
Yeah, that's so important for reading. I completely agree with that. But I also wanted to address microlectures and tell you about a study that was done at the Warrush School of Maritime Science and Engineering. And over 3 different courses in over a year's time, they looked at the frequency that students were viewing microlectures compared to long lectures. And when they were given a choice, basically they ignored the long lectures and they chose the micro lectures. And they have data to show that students would keep going back and reviewing those micro lectures. But within those micro lectures, they also did have embedded questions. You wouldn't have to do it that way. You could still have questions that come, after each micro lecture that they need to answer. But it was just an amazing response rate for being able to go back and review, even though they were not getting grades. They weren't getting points for doing that. They were just doing that voluntarily.
And I do want to just touch on, maybe the person asking that question is sort of philosophically opposed to grading. Somebody engaged with me last week on Twitter based on an article that came out last week that I wrote about giving students points to doing these tasks. And somebody commented, well, I don't really want to reward that kind of expected behavior. And so I think that's fair to maybe some people have a pedagogical purposeful reason not to want to grade, or it can also be a time issue. Although I think that approaches like specifications grading that Linda Nilsson sort of developed, that she has a book by that name, can really help get students to do some critical thinking and turn in some work that doesn't take you very long to grade. There is a way in most learning management systems to require students to do an activity that is worth 0 points, but they can't move on in the course until you set that up. So it's just a setting in your learning management system. And if you're interested in that, you might contact your local instructional designer or your learning management system help desk that requires students to answer some questions, submit an assignment, take a survey, and it's worth actually 0 points, but because of the way that you've structured it, that the rest of the course isn't available until they've done that activity, it does add that accountability without grading. That's another option.
So Flower's making a really interesting point, and a good one, about rewards, in this case grades. Grading is an adaptive response. It's really hard to privilege reading if it's worth no points. So if our outcome is to get students reading and thinking about their reading and engaging with their reading, it can be a series of low stakes assignments where they do the reading and they post a reflection, and it can all be automated. But I don't think you can be grading other things and then expect them to do the reading or participate or have robust discussion circles if they're not getting points for that.
Definitely what we value, we assess, right? And so it communicates that you value their work with the reading or the lecture when you offer points for those activities. I'm certainly a big fan myself of that approach.
Fantastic. And if we remember from a previous webinar, April Mondi from Delta State pointed out that one strategy she uses is to have little mini quizzes to go with her mini lectures or micro lectures, so that students see the value in gaining the material because it's being used. And in my own course, those micro lectures and quizzes are the simplest and lowest level of points that set them up to have better conversations because they're familiar with the topics that we're discussing over a 3-week period. And then finally to do a reflective essay. And so they build, and there's 3 chances for them to demonstrate that they understand the concepts at different levels of thinking. And in universal design for language parlance, it's also giving them different levels of challenge. And so you've all brought up some fantastic ideas. And I want to maybe make a slight pivot, or we'll move along the nodes of a concept map, since that's what the question's about. what's the best way for students to create concept maps without having to spend too much time learning how to use a specific website? No Flower, I think you even mentioned they might be able to draw it out on paper and take a phone picture, but maybe have some ideas about constructive ways that students can use concept mapping or other visualization strategies to help them with the reading or microlecture process.
Yeah, you know, I'm a big fan of drawing it out on paper. And in fact, recently I've taken to holding my smartphone like this, recording while I make a concept map on the page in front of me. And it's a kind of that talk aloud, think aloud idea where I just show, and it's a little wobbly and that's okay. I just show students, here's how I'm thinking about this topic. And that provides students with an example of how they can also be, you know, in my example, a lot of times I'm scribbling things out, or it's a really messy concept map or whatever it might be, but it helps students to observe that process in a very informal yet meaningful way. And so again, something on paper with, you know, you can take a picture of it. If you want, you could offer students the opportunity to do a big concept map on a larger piece of paper using Post-it notes or colorful markers. Some of those ideas would really engage some of our students. And along the idea of universal design for learning, offering learners different ways to complete a task helps to engage them. And then the other thing, you know, probably PowerPoint. I haven't done this myself, but I imagine, in fact, I've seen that in recent versions of PowerPoint, there are templates that you can use. So I think it would be not too hard to create a concept map using software like that as well.
And as another idea, the use of concept maps, you can have students do a concept map of how they're thinking about whatever it is they're studying before they actually do a reading or view a micro lecture, and then do a concept map afterwards as a way of showing what might have changed.
Love it.
Fantastic. And then there are some online tools that are fairly easy to use, and some apps if people are using smartphones as their only means of going through the remote learning process. And so we'll post some of those in the chat. One of them is bubble.us, bubble without the E, and another one I think is called Poplet. So those are some of the easier ones to use, but I love the idea, and similar to what Michael West showed us in some of the other webinars, that he just writes it out on paper. Don't make it harder than it needs to be, or use Post-its if students have those at their disposal, and put them on a wall and take a picture of it. I like that, especially because you can move them around as you have different ideas about how those relationships are formed between the concepts.
Can I add something?
Please.
Flower was talking about think alouds, and that's a great way to also back up the conversation. That's when an instructor simply starts talking through aloud the way they would think about solving a problem, the way they might think about reading, the way they might think about starting a paper, whatever the assessment is or the task is. Students are really fascinated by this. It's sort of it's a little bit vicarious. It's sort of like eavesdropping. It's like the reason why talk shows are so popular, because we love to listen to other people thinking or talking in a certain setting. So I would say that if you can do think aloud protocol before you do any sort of task that's discipline related or conceptually difficult, even before your concept map, that's a really good way to go. So it's just, you just stop and think, and you'd wander a little bit, right? How would I think about this? How might I solve this? How would I start to fill this in? Whatever the task is, you will model a little bit of wandering, but you're showing students that's okay. Because a lot of students think that writing, you write one time and you're done. That's what experts do. But writing is rewriting. These are all iterative processes. Reading is rereading, but not too much. So even concept mapping, it's a little bit messy. Learning looks messy. I think that's okay. So think aloud protocols, very useful.
Nice. And since we did start to cross that line from pedagogy to technology in that last question, someone asked about how to embed quiz questions in microlectures. And I can think of a pedagogical strategy as well as a technological strategy, but I want to hear from the three of you before I chime in there.
I don't know the technical, the technical answer what I do know is that a lot of people do it, and that a lot of these questions were asked and answered in last week's webinar in the recording of microlectures. But in terms of how people do it, and I certainly, worked with instructors to help them decide how to do it, is deciding when it's appropriate to ask the question, in the lecture itself. So when I worked with a math instructor, he kept thinking through, I'm going to give them this much information. And it's really not that different from the way that science teachers use what's called process-oriented guided inquiry learning, where the students are given just enough information and then just the right questions to get them to be able to construct their own knowledge. So sometimes it's coming up with the concept. In the math course, it's trying to come up with the right solution to a particular type of problem. I know that we use lecture capture, and I know that they were able to do that with lecture capture. But you can also play and then pause, right? And say, have the students answer these questions now. So it doesn't take a lot of technical skill to do that.
I know of a couple of platforms that allow you to embed questions in the videos. Some of those services might be a fee though. So, and then some schools have enabled that feature in their own video capturing and streaming services as well. So you can play pause it is one that I'm aware of. It's that you can embed the questions, and it might be worth, again, that accountability and that structure. But I also agree with Ludy's point that you can just ask students to pause the video and do something on paper that they then submit later. Or of course, you can make very small videos, very short ones that are immediately followed by an activity or a quiz that they must complete before going on to the next one.
And I think building on Ludy and Flower's comments, I think the most powerful, whether it's a series of micro lectures or one long video where the speaker says, now press pause and go do X, though that's, again, that prompt for students that they know that they have to interact with the world in some way, to go inward and reflect on what they've just heard or seen, and maybe even apply what strategies from the textbook did this person demonstrate in doing the whatever they did in the last scene of this video clip or what have you. So when you get to practical things like sales or things in the business college that might need to have some prompts for students to apply what they're reading and what they're experiencing. Fantastic. You three are the dream team for sure. Now, one question that we got related to the difference between graduate and undergraduate students and whether or not you see any differences or not with respect to how you light up the runway for the reading and or micro lecture consumption process.
I'd like to just say something about the difference in undergraduates and graduates, and then let Kat and Flower go on from there. But one of the things we do know about is something called an expertise reversal effect, where the higher the level of expertise, the less beneficial what we call the most active learning strategies. In fact, those active learning strategies that we like so much with undergraduates who typically would not have the higher levels of expertise. It works really well with them, but it doesn't work so well when people do gain higher levels of expertise.
And what I was thinking about is that's really an interesting point. And certainly I think the maturity level and the learning process and work commitment, I think those are all there in different ways for graduate students who are clearly in a graduate program for a clear goal that they have for themselves. However, I would also remind us that especially in online classes, our learners are very busy people who are typically, the research shows, also working oftentimes full-time and caring for family members as well. And so although we may not need to provide the same level of guidance or support for graduate students, I do think that graduate students are very selective about how they choose to engage when they have so many other competing demands on their time. So I'm still a big fan of offering that accountability and that structure with some kind of an assessment of their learning as they've engaged, just to help them see that it's a priority to do.
I would say, yes, accountability and structure still are very important. Yeah, I agree.
I think it
Fantastic.
really, I think that there's a caveat here, which is know your graduate student body. There's a continuum of grad students right now. You have older folks re-entering, people getting upskilled or reskilled, folks who are coming right out of undergraduate school. We know that reading actually can present just as big of a problem. I mean, I remember in my grad program, folks were complaining about the reading, and that was like 100 years ago. So I still think the reading, especially graduate level reading, hundreds of pages, 500 pages a week. I am seeing, at least on my campus, that there is a real lack of understanding sometimes about the link between communities of practice and reading and disciplinary reading structures. So, but to Ludi's point, I would recommend Marjorie Ginsburg's Motivating Adult Learners, because she says, and she and her husband Ray say, that it's the same, it's in many ways the same process. Yes, undergrads are different. You're talking about folks with significant prior knowledge that can get in the way, can be a barrier to entry. On the other hand, if you motivate by being responsive and creating community and honoring where people are, then I think the work still applies. And I definitely think scaffolding is perfectly normative even at this stage.
Amazing. Well, before we close this thing out, I'm wondering if the three of you might do a Twitter version or a micro version, to be more appropriate for our webinar today, of one key takeaway that you'd give to our participants, maybe with people who are new to remote learning in mind. What's one thing that you think people could take and try right away in their own classes?
Shall I start?
Go
or
ahead,
not?
Ludi. Go for it.
I would say start small, and that's what we did in a media legalities course, by the way, where reading a law brief was actually considered interesting reading. Start small, just do a video here or there, search for really good ones that are online that you can interweave, and then ask your own questions. And the two basic ones that are really excellent, I still think these are wonderful, is to ask a student, what did you find that was most important? And what did you find that was most difficult?
Kat.
Those are golden line questions, by the way. So those are perennially excellent questions. I would say make sure you practice social presence online. Make sure that you have a community online. Make learning social, make reading social. Students have to see themselves and each other in the material.
Love that. And it won't be a surprise to anyone who's been with us for the full hour, but I would just add the importance of accountability and structure. I love the sequence that Kat sort of suggested, but again, with a view to maybe people who are doing this remotely for the very first time, teaching in online environments. Maybe it's just adding one thing that you ask students to do to demonstrate to you that they engaged with the material and what are bringing their questions or their takeaways from it. So accountability and structure for me.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, I'd like to thank the three of you so much for this incredible discussion. And we hope that this is just the start of the conversation. At our webinar page, you'll also be able to find a recording of today's session and a transcript. You also can find a discussion board that will be moderated by ACUE and our experts over the next couple of weeks. Please visit and add your thoughts.